Thanks for tuning into this episode of History's Greatest Battles. As always, if you enjoy this episode or any of the others, subscribe and share it with a friend. The battle today, also known as a siege, is known in some German historiographies as Die Deutschschlacht, or the German battle. Despite it not taking place on German or European soil, and Greater Germany had no stake in the fight, nonetheless, they call it the German battle because roughly a third of all soldiers involved were German. We know this battle as the Siege of Yorktown, the decisive battle that gave America her independence from Britain. Today, there are 30 U.S. Army units with lineages that go back to the colonial era, and specifically, we've got 4 Army National Guard units and 1 active regular Army Field Artillery Battalion that fought in the Battle of Yorktown. Let's now experience the siege, the Battle of Yorktown.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 53, The Battle of Yorktown, September through October of 1781. American and French forces, roughly 18,800 Americans and 7,000 French infantrymen. British forces, roughly 6,000 British infantry with some Hessian mercenaries. The resounding American victory shattered British morale, forcing the English public to demand a change in leadership. The new government, facing the undeniable reality of defeat, initiated peace talks that ultimately secured independence for the United States.
With the thunderous American victory at Saratoga in the autumn of 1777, the fledgling United States clawed its way into the global arena, earning recognition from France. Soon after, Spain and the Netherlands followed suit, acknowledging the rising republic's defiance. This recognition brought more than diplomatic gestures. It unlocked the vault of European might. The alliance unleashed the supplies, weaponry, and the men the rebels so desperately needed, empowering their armies to stand in force alongside the iron-willed resolve of leaders like George Washington, whose moral fortitude had held the revolution together. By the summer of 1778, Washington's army marched victoriously back into Philadelphia. The city, abandoned by British forces as General William Howe recalled to New York, prepared to make his final exit from the war's leadership stage. In his place rose General Henry Clinton, a man whose arrival in command would shape the coming storms of the conflict. Clinton's first steps as commander showed little hunger for relentless war. Rather than pursue the rebels with the hammer of British force, he entrenched himself in New York City, steeling its defenses for an American assault he believed to be inevitable, a battle Washington had no intention of giving him. For 2 long years after Washington reclaimed Philadelphia, the war entered a tense lull. Skirmishes flickered like scattered embers, but neither side made a decisive move. By the summer of 1780, Clinton turned to treachery, attempting to weaponize Benedict Arnold's betrayal to seize West Point, the vital American stronghold on the Hudson. The plot unraveled, and once again, Clinton retreated to the safety of fortifications rather than risk open combat. Meanwhile, Washington focused his energies on sharpening the edge of the Continental Army. With European arms and supplies now flowing, he turned his gaze to strategy, planning alongside the newly arrived French forces under the steady hand of Comte de Rochambeau. While Washington honed his forces in the northern strongholds of Rhode Island and Connecticut, Clinton, growing restless, sought a new course. Every British strategy thus far had shattered against the rock of American defiance. Neither Burgoyne's disastrous 1777 campaign, which sought to cleave the colonies by controlling the Hudson, nor the treachery of Arnold had delivered the British victory they craved. Howe's grand capture of Philadelphia, far from breaking the rebellion, had done little but displace the seat of revolution for a time. The heart of the uprising beat on. Since their early triumph in seizing New York City in the late summer of 1776, the British war effort had stalled, a mighty war machine grinding in place. Clinton, seeing the futility of further northern campaigns, decided to shift the theater of war. He turned his gaze south, to lands where loyalist numbers promised an easier victory and where revolutionary passion burned with less intensity. His plan was to sweep through the southern states, rolling up the revolution and cutting off Washington's forces from their southern allies, strangling the rebellion into submission. To execute this bold southern gambit, Clinton dispatched Lord Charles Cornwallis to South Carolina in the summer of 1780. His mission? Harness the Loyalist strength in the Carolinas and Virginia, and subdue the rebellion in the South. Clinton believed that the Loyalists in these regions would eagerly swell the British ranks, making Cornwallis's task a simple matter of occupation and order. With revolutionary forces spread thin in the South, British commanders expected little resistance, envisioning a swift and a bloodless victory. Yet from the moment Cornwallis set foot on southern soil, the plan began to unravel. Though his initial landing near Charleston met little difficulty, and he forced General Benjamin Lincoln to surrender the city, the seeds of failure were already being sown. Charleston's streets soon erupted in flames, a city ablaze with chaos. The cause, to this day, remains a mystery, but it was clear that Cornwallis's campaign had not begun with the triumph he had hoped for. Cornwallis, defying Clinton's orders, rejected the support of local loyalists, spurning their attempts to aid the British cause. Instead of strengthening his position, he began alienating the very people he had come to rely on. Like Burgoyne before him, Cornwallis managed to turn potential allies into actual foes. His dismissive attitude and reliance on foreign troops, reminiscent of Burgoyne's ill-fated use of Indians and Hessians, only deepened the resentment brewing among the local populace. As Cornwallis dug in, the Revolutionary War flared back to life in the South. Guerrilla fighters, led by men like the elusive Francis Marion, struck with precision, harassing British outposts and attacking supply lines in these relentless ambushes. In his fury, Cornwallis responded with brutal reprisals, unleashing his men to crush the resistance, but each act of vengeance only further alienated the local population, pushing potential loyalists deeper into the revolutionary cause. Still convinced of his eventual victory, Cornwallis marched out of Charleston to subdue the Carolinas. Meanwhile, the Continental Congress sent Horatio Gates to halt him, but Gates's overconfidence led to catastrophe. In the Battle of Camden, his forces crumbled under British fire, leaving the revolutionaries reeling. Sensing the gravity of the situation, Washington replaced Gates with the tactical genius of Nathaniel Greene, a commander whose mind was as sharp as his blade on the battlefield. Greene knew how to fight in the wild, unpredictable ways of guerrilla warfare, exactly what was needed to face Cornwallis. Throughout the winter of 1780 and 1781, the southern landscape was littered with sporadic skirmishes and bloody firefights, yet neither army landed a decisive blow. It was a slow-burning conflict, waiting for the right spark to ignite. Isolated from his supply lines, Cornwallis turned to the countryside for sustenance. His arrogance, compounded by his ruthless use of Hessians to seize whatever they could, turned the local populace against him. The British forces became as unwelcome as any enemy invader. When Cornwallis finally called for loyalist reinforcements, the response was a trickle. The enthusiasm he had expected from the Southern Loyalists had withered under the weight of British mismanagement. Ever mindful of his surroundings, Greene sought to earn the goodwill of the locals, though he could offer only the flimsy promises of IOUs from a struggling Continental Congress. His efforts stood in stark contrast to the British, who took what they needed by force. Greene's treatment, though imperfect, kept the revolutionary cause alive. As British supplies dwindled, their once proud army grew ragged, spirits frayed by hunger and exhaustion. Desperate to keep his men in fighting condition, Cornwallis marched to Wilmington, North Carolina, seeking to resupply and bolster his battered ranks. Reinforced and resupplied, Cornwallis pushed north into Virginia in the spring of 1781. Benedict Arnold, the infamous turncoat, had been marauding there for months, yet his efforts brought the British little gain. After months of marching without decisive results, Cornwallis, now wearied by his fruitless efforts, moved toward the coast. Following Clinton's orders, he began fortifying Yorktown, a position he believed the Royal Navy would reinforce, a coastal bastion nestled between the York and James rivers, where Cornwallis hoped to hold his ground. Meanwhile, Washington had persuaded the cautious Rochambeau to back an audacious assault on New York City. His plan was bold. He would pin the Royal Navy in New York Harbor using the might of the French fleet, while the Franco-American army stormed Clinton's defenses. But Rochambeau, who was wary of Washington's northern gambit, voiced his disapproval to Admiral de Grasse, expressing a preference for operations in the south, where the stakes were clearer and success more attainable. De Grasse, siding with Rochambeau, informed Washington that the French fleet would not venture beyond the Chesapeake Bay. With this new reality and reports of the British fortifications around New York, Washington wisely pivoted, conceding to Rochambeau's strategy. A decisive campaign would now unfold in Virginia. What seemed a potential disaster now turned into Washington's advantage. His plans for New York, sent to Lafayette in Virginia, had fallen into British hands. Clinton, now bracing for an assault he believed inevitable, unwittingly became a pawn in Washington's greater scheme. Seizing this moment, Washington unleashed a wave of deception. He planted false information, convincing Clinton that an attack was imminent. French forces made a show of strength near New York, shielding Washington's quiet march into New Jersey. Clinton prepared for a blow that would never fall. When Clinton finally grasped the truth that New York was never the target, Washington and Rochambeau were already deep into their march toward Virginia, leaving him outmaneuvered and utterly unprepared. As Greene and Lafayette shadowed Cornwallis like wolves stalking their prey, the French fleet, commanded by the Comte de Grasse, surged northward from the Caribbean. By late August, its warships darkened the horizon at the mouth of the Chesapeake, a fearsome blockade that sealed Cornwallis's fate. Still in New York, Clinton had received whispers of the French fleet's movement, but arrogantly brushed them aside as mere rumors. When the truth struck, he hastily dispatched Admiral Thomas Graves to the Chesapeake, hoping that he might turn the tide. Upon reaching the Chesapeake, Graves faced a grim reality. 24 French ships of the line dwarfed his own 19. On September the 5th, the two fleets clashed in a fierce naval engagement. De Grasse masterfully commanded his ships, blocking any British attempt to break into the bay and cutting Cornwallis off from the sea. The roar of cannon echoed for hours, but it was the British who bore the brunt of the devastation. Graves lingered for 3 fruitless days, but when he finally turned his battered fleet back toward New York for repairs, he unwittingly condemned Cornwallis's army to isolation and ultimately destruction. Washington and Rochambeau, linking with Lafayette's troops, now commanded a force nearly 16,000 men strong, twice the size of Cornwallis's besieged army. The siege began in earnest as Franco-American forces dug their trenches ever closer, tightening their noose around the British redoubts. Armed with superior numbers and overwhelming artillery, the Franco-American forces unleashed a relentless bombardment. Cornwallis's men, trapped behind their crumbling defenses, could do little but endure the onslaught. The pressure mounted daily, wearing down the British resolve as each cannonball shattered their hope of holding the line. In desperation, Cornwallis attempted a bold nighttime escape across the York River, seeking to slip past Washington's grasp. But the very elements turned against him. Violent winds and storms scattered his boats, forcing him back into the tightening jaws of the siege. The night of October the 15th saw the final hammer blows. The French stormed the larger British redoubt in a furious but brief battle, while the Americans, in a display of precision and speed, seized the smaller redoubt in a mere 10 minutes, with barely a scratch to show for it. Cornwallis, desperate now, ordered a last feeble raid on the rebel positions, but the effort was a shadow of what was needed. By October the 17th, the inevitability of defeat hung heavy in the air, and Cornwallis had no chance but to request terms of surrender. Cornwallis' stubborn resistance had hinged on the hope that Clinton would send reinforcements from New York. How they would ever breach the French naval blockade remained a mystery, yet Graves was indeed preparing for another round of battle. But as fate would have it, Graves set sail on October 17th. The same day, Cornwallis sought a surrender. Isolated, battered by relentless bombardment, and with winter looming, Cornwallis faced the brutal truth. There would be no rescue. His forces were on the verge of collapse. Surrender now was his only option. Hoping to preserve some dignity, Cornwallis proposed parole for himself and his men, promising they would never again take up arms in America. Washington, however, stood firm, demanding nothing less than their full surrender as prisoners of war. On October the 19th, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, Cornwallis' second-in-command, led 6,000 weary British soldiers in the most humiliating march of their lives. From Yorktown to Washington's headquarters, the road stretched out before them, every step a bitter reminder that they had been brought low by mere colonials. In a final bid to save face, O'Hara attempted to surrender to Rochambeau, hoping for the dignity of handing his sword to a fellow European. But Rochambeau referred to Washington. When O'Hara then offered his sword to Washington, he was once again refused. As protocol demanded, O'Hara was directed to Washington's second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln. And it was to him that O'Hara reluctantly surrendered the sword, symbolizing the end of British resistance. In the months and years that followed, Cornwallis and Clinton wasted no time in hurling blame at one another for the disaster at Yorktown. Clinton, however, bore the brunt of the political fallout. His career was left in tatters. Cornwallis, on the other hand, returned to England with his reputation mostly intact. He soon redeemed himself with a brilliant campaign in India, ensuring his legacy would not be defined by Yorktown alone. By the time news of Yorktown reached London, the British public had grown weary of the war's endless drain on blood and treasure. The government, reeling from the defeat, quickly collapsed under the weight of its failure. By the spring of 1782, with the old government in shambles, newly elected leaders sought an end to the conflict. They extended an olive branch, offering to negotiate peace, and by September, formal talks had begun in Paris. These negotiations dragged on for a year, culminating in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. With the stroke of a pen, the British government was forced to recognize the independence of the United States. The new nation's borders were drawn from the Atlantic in the east to the Mississippi in the west, and from the Great Lakes in the north to Florida in the south. As part of the peace terms, Spain was rewarded for its aid during the Revolution, particularly the efforts of Bernardo de Galvez, the governor of New Orleans. Florida, once lost to the British in the Treaty of 1763, was returned to Spanish hands. Yorktown shattered British ambitions in America, bringing their colonial experiment to a bitter end, though they still held on to Canada. At the negotiating table in Paris, the British attempted to retain control of the land west of the Appalachian Mountains, a move that would have choked American expansion for generations. Yet true peace eluded both nations. The British clung stubbornly to forts in the Great Lakes region and continued to show little respect for American sovereignty on the high seas, setting the stage for future tensions. These simmering hostilities, particularly over restrictive trade policies, eventually reignited into full-scale conflict. Between 1805 and 1812, these tensions culminated in a second war between these two powers. It was only after this bloody rematch that relations between America and Britain finally began to ease. If Cornwallis had managed to escape Yorktown before Washington's arrival in late September, the war might have dragged on a little longer. Yet given the immense strain on Britain's economy and its people's growing fatigue, the inevitable collapse of British resolve would have come all the same, though perhaps delayed by a few months. Yet, without Cornwallis's crushing defeat at Yorktown, America's position at the negotiating table would have been far more fragile. The treaty's terms could have been harsher, potentially stifling the young nation's expansion for years, if not decades. The French contribution to the victory at Yorktown cannot be overstated. Their involvement was pivotal, and the reverberations of the war's outcome were felt far beyond American shores. King Louis's vast financial commitment to the American cause drained the French treasury dry. The economic devastation, combined with the revolutionary ideals that many French soldiers brought home from the American battlefields, sowed the seeds of their own uprising, the French Revolution of 1789. Though Louis had succeeded in striking a heavy blow against his ancient rival, England, the cost was steep. His support of the American Revolution ultimately contributed to his downfall, as he lost both his throne and his life in the storm of revolution that swept through France. America, though, doesn't forget her friends. Over a century later, amidst the tumult of World War I, after the horrors of Verdun and the Brusilov offensive, America entered the fray. Upon arriving on the continent and after a parade in a town in France, they approached the monument, the tomb, of the man that convinced King Louis to join the American cause in their fight for freedom and liberty. After showing their reverence, they announced, "Lafayette, we are here."